All right, so welcome and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Don McKenzie. I'm the Allen and Inger Osberg Endowed Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the University of Washington. I want to thank the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, PACTRANS, as one of the co-sponsors of our event. PACTRANS is a federally funded university transportation center based here at the University of Washington, focused on research, education, and workforce development for transportation in the Pacific Northwest region. Our other co-sponsor is the Washington Policy Center, and I don't have the two-line description of your mission, sorry. But there are other co-sponsors, and so appreciate the support from both PACTRANS and the WPC. Transit in our state is facing some difficult times and some difficult choices here, much as it is across the country. And I hope that this evening we can start some discussions and maybe some provocative discussions about some of these challenges and stimulate some bigger thinking about how we move forward. And to that end, I'm joined by three panelists this evening who are seated to my right. The first is Doug McDonald. Doug is a former secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation. Prior to that, he was responsible for the greater Boston area's water and wastewater system. And since his time at WashDOT, he has become a pedestrian activist and has been involved with Seattle's Transit Master Plan. Secondly, we have Doug Wisner. Doug spent... Thank you, Jack Wisner. Sorry. Sorry, Jack. Jack spent 33 years at King County Metro as a transit planner. He identifies network design as his favorite part of the job. He has been a political activist on a variety of issues in our region since 1972. He's a part of the First Avenue Transit Alliance. He's an avid cyclist. And he has a bachelor's and a master's in economics from the University of Washington. And finally, on the end, we have Charles Prestrud. Charles is director of the Coles Transportation Center at the Washington Policy Center. And prior to that, he was a planning manager at WashDOT for 20 years. And prior to that, a planning manager with Community Transit. So we have a great group with us tonight. Before I turn things over to them, I wanted to start with some numbers to highlight some of the challenges that we are facing, that are facing transit in our region and in our state. So firstly, you can see a chart of changes in transit mode shares for commuting in 2019, 2021, and 2022. So this is really when the COVID pandemic hit, and you can see that although you see a significant increase in working from home, of course, we see drops in driving, a smaller in absolute terms, but a much larger in relative terms drop in transit mode share. So it's that sort of 50% or so drop or more in transit that has caused a lot of difficulties. So even though it's starting from a smaller baseline, again, in relative terms, this has been a huge change with COVID. If we look back since 2015, we can see that two things on this figure. The first is on the left axis, the blue series is unlinked passenger trips. So these are transit boardings. It's the total number of transit trips made. This is for all agencies, all transit modes in Washington State. And so you can see that large drop in 2020, further in 2021, and a slow climb back up since then. But over the same period, the red series, which is plotted on the right axis, shows operating expenses. And so operating expenses have gone up 86% from 2015 to 2024. That's 40% after adjusting for inflation. Over the same period, ridership is still 18% below where it was in 2015. And when you put those together, what you see is that the operating cost per trip, again, this is for all agencies, all transit modes in Washington, operating cost per transit trip is up 128%, or a 72% increase after adjusting for inflation. These trends are not unique to the Puget Sound region or any one agency. Neither is our region exempt. So it's a bit like a plate of spaghetti here with these lines. But what they're really meant to show is that whether you look at kind of the overall trend for all agencies across the state, whether you look within the region, both the all agencies, all modes, and the PSRC region, all modes, have followed almost the same trend here, especially the last few years. King County Metro, their sort of all modes numbers, their bus-only numbers closely track with the bus numbers for the state as a whole. So there is a bit of a gap here. PSRC and all agencies, all modes, doing a little better than some of these others, but still about between 20 and 40% below 2015. Now, part of the reason for that gap is shown here. So this is Sound Transit. Now, this series on top is Sound Transit's ridership in unlinked passenger trips normalized to 2015 levels. And so you look at this and you say, hey, or maybe you look at this and you say, hey, that looks good. But what you need to remember is that Sound Transit has massively increased the amount of service provided since 2015. And so if we look today, where the average occupancy of Sound Transit's trains, so this is Sound Transit Light Rail, it's the ratio of passenger miles traveled, that is how many miles they move passengers in the aggregate, divided by their vehicle miles, revenue miles. We see here relatively flat before 2019, a big drop, and we're back now about 15% below where that was in 2019. So this is average vehicle occupancy. So the average Sound Transit light rail train is carrying about 25 people in 2024. Now, this is not just about money, it's also about environmental impacts. Many of the benefits of transit accrue only if vehicles are occupied. So for example, if you look around the US, 90% of bus agencies in the US emit more than 267 grams of CO2 per passenger mile. That is basically the 267 grams of CO2 per mile is the emissions intensity of driving an average US car, getting 22 miles per gallon with average occupancy 1.5 people per car. So 90% of agencies and about 62% of bus passenger miles in the country are more carbon intensive than driving an average car with average occupancy. So where does that leave us and where are we going, I guess, more to the point? This is a forecast from the Puget Sound Regional Council from their 2018 plan. And what you see here is that in 2018, PSRC was projecting a sharp turn in the rate of growth in boardings. These are passenger trips. So they were basically projecting a much faster rate of growth in passenger trips than had been seen previously. They're also projecting sizable increases in the amount of service offered. This is annual service hours. And when you look at this, what you see is the convergence of these lines and the fact that the boardings line is increasing more steeply than the service hours line. That reflects an assumption of increased productivity. So that would mean more boardings per revenue service hour. And that's not what we've seen. And what we've seen instead, roughly, is this kind of falling off here. So it puts us into a difficult position. And with that, with that setup, that cheerful setup, I want to turn now to our panel and kind of ask the question of, what can we realistically expect from transit in the decades ahead, and what actions can we take to address the unfavorable trends that we see? So to start that, maybe as a first question to the panel, we've been seeing a lot of progress in new transportation technologies, in ride sharing and in automation of vehicles. So given the persistently low ridership that we're seeing and rising costs per trip and per passenger mile, along with the advent of potentially lower cost automated taxi services, Should transit agencies be rethinking the role of fixed route services or reconsidering their emphasis on ridership versus coverage in allocating transit services? Who wants to start?
Go for it.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I certainly think that transit agencies should restructure their service. At Metro, I think it's past time that they do away with all one-way peak-only service. They should integrate more forcibly with Link and Sounder. And those modes are faster and have great available capacity, as you showed. And so we shouldn't have any more one-way peak-only routes. Most of them are suspended right now. They got suspended during COVID. And when Metro has enough operators, they'll bring those hours back. And I expect that they'll put them back in as two-way all-day routes. Metro is engaged in an experiment. They call it Metro Flex, where they're using computer-driven small vehicles. And these pilots are largely failures because they're too costly. And so I guess if driverless technology arrives, it might be applied to transit, and if you had a transit line that was, very fixed and maybe that's the one where you put the driverless technology on and carry even more people. So I think we need to change transit, but I'm not sure in the way that you suggest.
Charles?
Let me kind of build on that. It's pretty clear from the slides that you showed us that transit has two fundamental problems. One is the rise in operating costs, which prevent expansion of service because the more cost per hour, the fewer hours of service you can provide. And the other problem is that most of the growth in the region is in suburban areas where transit band is pretty low. And so you end up with routes with low ridership and low productivity, even though they're expensive to provide. So for those parts of the region, and actually all over the state actually, a more economical alternative needs to be found. And I think autonomous vehicles do have some potential to do that. In fact, they may even be able to improve service because they can provide on-demand point-to-point service, even though vehicles will probably be much smaller. It'll be more convenient. So I think there is real potential there. As Jack pointed out, Metro has been tinkering with smaller vehicles that are dispatched on demand. But because they have Metro operators, no, they don't? Okay. You do still have very significant operating costs because you've got humans driving them. So ultimately, that's the problem that needs to be solved.
Jack, did you want to respond?
He reminded me of the chart. And I'm not really upset with the increase in operating costs that the chart showed. We have inflation. I think the main parts of the chart we need to pay attention to is that several agencies did things in 2019 that the peak of ridership was actually in 2018, and COVID was in 2020. Ridership fell in 2019 as well because of what WashDOT and Seattle and Metro and Sound Transit did to downtown Seattle. The biggest thing was that the county sold Convention Place Station to the convention center and ended joint operation prematurely. Okay, and operating costs, the charts are dominated by COVID. Remember 100 years ago we had the Spanish flu. Similar things happened to society. It's a really big deal. And so gradually society will come back into form. I don't know when. I heard some economists debate this several months ago. They thought maybe office work would come back in full stead in 2028. Nobody knows.
Doug, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, only in this respect. I think there's a real problem with the notion that transit is some kind of an amalgam that has a unity. There's enormous amount of differentiation in how people use transit and what purposes transit serves. And so, for example, and I'm come to the point where, back to you started, should transit focus on fixed route service and trying to maintain the productivity or enhance the productivity of fixed route service? And I think that's absolutely essential, because I think an enormous amount of mobility demand, and we really need to look at transit as a part of the larger question of how mobility demand is used or implemented. A huge amount of mobility demand has to do with moving people essentially on routes that they use continually. And if you look at the E-line, and I want to make one other point, which is that in thinking about the future of transit, we are, if you ask people, what are we talking about? Well, 80% of the question is what's going to happen to Sound Transit 3. And 10% of the question is happening to, what's happening on the 8. And 3% of the question is what's happening in South King County with little vans. Those are really different problems. And we have, to me, I think we've lost sight somewhat of the fact that if you want to ask the question, where will transit be in 20 years in terms of serving overall mobility demand, I think that is going to be dominated by fixed route service on buses. I don't think that the light rail here and there, I'm highly skeptical that we will see much of Sound Transit 3 actually in place, certainly not for decades at this point. And we have an enormous investment in a very strong bus system, and we need to focus on the continual efforts to strengthen and adapt that bus service. But fixed route bus service is not going to solve the problem of the 15-minute city or the 10-minute city or what it's supposed to be, of whether or not I take a bus to the Fred Meyer, get an Uber, ride a scooter, or walk. And those are very different sorts of things that we're trying to do in mobility. And I think you have to break up what you want mobility to do and then think about how transit, in a number of respects, serves those different purposes, and then disaggregate it all and ask yourself, what do you want to have happen for various parts of the overall question of mobility demand as met by transit?
Do we, and maybe this is a question that can start with Jack, but do we have a sense of how big this effect could be? So if Metro, you said 90% of the talk is on Sound Transit, Doug, but there's a lot of important detail in what Metro does with its buses. So if Metro were to deploy resources to increase ridership and operating efficiency, do you have a sense of how much ridership could be increased?
Charles gave me that question as a preview, and I really don't want to answer it. I think Metro could do a better job, and over 30 years they have done a much better job up until 2019. You can see in Seattle and King County that there's much better crosstown service than there used to be, much better frequency. Routes like the C, D, and E are very successful. As those one-way peak-only routes that are suspended now come back as two-way routes, it'll do what you are asking for. But I don't know to the degree to which it'll succeed. I know that when I worked on restructures, in each case, the rides and rides per hour improved because the network was better. We gave people shorter waits and better speed. One example is the Aurora restructure that Doug refers to, which is the E-line now after 2014. We did the Aurora consolidation in February of 1999. You can see this button here. It's for operator Mark McLaughlin, who was killed on the 359. In February of 99, we consolidated 4 routes into one. We gave people less coverage, but more frequency, more speed, and ridership went up. And it went up so much that the sub-area was willing to put their new hours into the 358 in 2003. So, I mean, network structure matters, and I'm optimistic about the future, but there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do because some of these restructures are difficult to do.
Looks like Charles wants to join in.
I give Metro credit for Rapid Ride. They were slow in implementing it, and they didn't do it very economically in some ways. I mean, Metro doesn't do anything on the cheap. But I'm less optimistic than you are. And part of the reason for
That's why we're here.
Yes. If you look at overall service productivity, it's dropped from like 30 riders per service hour to about 20. And so what that tells us is that even though Rapid Ride and some of the other improvements you referred to have helped on those routes, overall service productivity is lower today than it was 10 years ago. So I'm not as optimistic that Metro or transit agencies generally in the state of Washington are going to be able to substantially increase ridership in the years ahead. If we're lucky, 10 years from now, we'll be about where we were in 2019. But we need to keep in mind that even before COVID hit, ridership for most of the agencies in the state was either flat or declining. So it's not an easy problem to solve. And if anything, the market for mobility is getting more fragmented with Uber and Lyft and e-bicycles. And long before Sound Transit is able to build out light rail lines, we're going to have autonomous vehicles, which are going to be far more convenient for people. So it's going to be a very competitive market, and because transit agencies are notoriously slow in evolving and adapting and innovating, I'm not optimistic they're going to be able to compete very effectively.
I think I have to retort one more time.
Okay, then we'll get to you, Doug.
Another good example is Spokane Transit Authority. Mm-hmm. They have a good network designer. He's a friend of mine. And they've improved their network. And so they're probably rebounding faster from COVID than other transit agencies.
So I'm going to jump. That's the slide I didn't include. They're actually above where they were.
I want to praise the current Metro managers because they saw what Charles said about the expense and slowness of Rapid Ride implementation. And this spring, they implemented network-wide proof of payment fare collection, and they're hiring more inspectors. So that could be a triple win. You get faster fare collection, all door boarding and alighting. You get more security and more riders. So that's a cause for optimism.
Well, I have for a long time been a transit believer. I ride the bus. I don't drive. I don't not drive because my wife drives, and so we have a car. But for vision impairment, I lost my driver's license in 2006. I've lived in Seattle since 2007. I've never driven a car in Seattle. And today I had 4 boardings. I went down the first hill. I rode the E line down and back. I rode the G line twice. And when I ride the bus, I feel that I'm participating in a form of mobility which is for me functional. It is for me essentially convenient. And I feel it helps because I built roads when I was at WashDOT, but I do believe, as an ideology, that the car thing is a big problem. And I don't think we're going to get rid of cars, and I think that's a recognition we have to confront with, but I would like to see stronger transit service because I think there's lots of us who want to use it and can use it and lots more people who could. For that reason, if I had a pulpit, I would try to direct investment to improvements in the bus system, which I believe would pay dividends in mobility in even the short remaining period of my lifetime, which is far shorter than the expectation of when we're going to see projects under ST3, which was sold to the public as mass transit now, and is not. And maybe I believe that Sound Transit 3 was designed for the voters by somebody who sold to planners in our region the same magic marker that they gave to Donald Trump to show where the hurricane was supposed to go. It is not a transit plan. It was a political plan. It's compromised by an agency which is almost utterly hamstrung. And so I'm a proponent of doing everything we can to improve the reliability and service contribution of bus transit. I don't believe that Uber is for ordinary people. If I had wanted to take my drive today to First Hill to see a friend, it would have been a $40 Uber ride both ways. I benefit from a senior discount on my Orca. I paid $1 for 4 rides, which is 25 cents a ride. Now, I'm almost guilty about that because that's a pretty obvious subsidy that somebody's paying for my transportation. But those are the directions that I think we should go to make more transit available to serve more purposes for more people. And I believe in buses.
And does more... Oh, man. Okay. Okay, no, I want to follow up first on... So does more services, more benefit, more mobility, more people, does that mean more places or more frequency?
It means first, well, you can get into the frequency, productivity, service coverage thing. It's the old, A before B, before B, before C. I mean, you can't solve it. But I believe that, I think most people's experience is that service frequency is an enormous inducement to their desire to rely on transit for their trips. And so I think that service frequency on the routes that will reward service frequency is the first place to put transit investment. I think coverage is also very important. But I think coverage feeds service frequency, and so I think the idea that one of the reasons I love the Rapid Ride, which is a work in progress, and I mean we've got problems right now. Rapid Ride extensions are being delayed because of fiscal constraints and other sorts of problems. We don't have a perfect Rapid Ride system, but we have the embryo of a system that is delivering better efficiency for Rapid Ride and better opportunity, and I think it should be improved. And then I think people who are riding the 45 to get to the E-line or the 48, those are also coverage implements which make the whole system work better. So I'm in all of the above.
So when we talk about ridership, density is necessary to drive transit ridership, but not necessarily sufficient. The Growth Management Act, the GMA, was passed over 30 years ago, and we still, as we saw, don't have a real boom in transit ridership in our region or in our state. Jarrett Walker, though, notes that it's dangerous to focus on average density. He talks about the peril of average density, arguing that the fraction of the population that lives in high-density areas is a more important predictor of transit ridership than metro area density overall. When I go back to Vancouver, I am often struck, Vancouver, not Vancouver, I'm pointing north to BC, I'm often struck by the sheer scale of high-density development around their SkyTrain stations. There's a huge amount of residential capacity and mixed use and commercial businesses. So to me, this looks like an obvious solution. Allow more high-density, market-driven development. Let developers come in and build in areas where there's going to be demand for transit services once the people are there. So I'm curious what you all see as keys to realizing ridership goals, especially for high-capacity transit. And maybe we should start with Charles.
Well, I wish that simply adjusting land use plans would address transit's challenges. But 30 years of experience tells us it's a very slow and uncertain process. When we look at the goals of the Growth Management Act, which created significant incentives for higher density residential and employment growth, and then we look at actual trends, we see that the vast majority of growth around the region isn't in those designated urban growth centers. In fact, between 1990 and 2010, only 7% of the region's population growth was in the 27 designated urban centers. 93% or a little bit more was outside those centers. And that was during the time when the Growth Management Act was in effect. Well, it still is. So if we're waiting for that, waiting for the Growth Management Act to kick in so that we get high-density urban centers is going to be a very long wait. And I would also point out that most of the region, most of the urban parts of the region, are already zoned or allow higher density development. So places like downtown Everett, Tacoma, Renton, Kent, you can build much higher density than is there today, even in most of Seattle. Why don't we see that happening? Well, it's because those projects don't pencil out. And people are choosing where they want to live and where they want to start businesses. And the vast majority isn't in downtown Seattle or even in the U District where there has been significant growth. It's in places like Marysville and Arlington and Monroe and Sammamish and Issaquah and down in suburban unincorporated Pierce County. So as long as people have some choice where they want to live, and I don't see any change to that coming anytime soon, and they vote with their feet and their dollars to move to places that are lower density, the vision of high-density urban centers somehow making transit more productive, it's going to be a marginal increase at best.
Yes, I believe it will be a marginal increase, and it'll be good. And you mentioned both Vancouver, BC, TransLink, and Jared Walker. Let me say I'm a fan of both. Okay, I read his book twice. I agree with almost everything there. TransLink does transit and land use much better than we do here. In your notes to us, you mentioned automated SkyTrain.
I was working my way towards that.
Okay, well, when that comes up, I'll have a remark. But let's get back to land use. I think the demarcation are the towns that developed before World War II. They tend to have a tight street grid, and those towns that developed after World War II don't have a tight street grid. So the ones that have a tight street grid are much better for transit because they're better for pedestrians. And those places actually have increased transit. Downtown Kenmore, downtown Bothell, downtown Redmond, downtown Kirkland, Renton, Kent, But other places that are newer, like Federal Way and Linwood, are sort of urban center waterbees. So Charles is right. We're not sure when they're going to happen. But if you go to downtown Redmond today, it looks like a real city, okay? They took steps 10 years ago to change the couplet of Redmond Way and Cleveland Street. They wanted it to be a two-way street. They wanted it to be friendly to pedestrians. It predates Link, okay? They already laid the bones down. And Shoreline is doing great things. Shoreline is actually taxing themselves and building sidewalks. That's where I grew up. And I grew up in the center of Shoreline where there was a street grid. When I was a paper boy, I had sidewalks, And Shoreline's going to make themselves a better city.
I would just point out that the transit mode share on the east side is what, 1%, maybe 2% at most. Maybe if everything goes really well, it gets up to 2.5% or 3%. So, the incremental improvement, that's nice, but that's not really going to do very much to address the region's overall mobility needs. And it's still going to be a challenge for transit, which faces this problem of diminishing returns on investment as costs go up. And, most of the highest productive routes are already served pretty well. And as you expand service, it's typically to areas where there isn't as much demand. So this is not a problem that is easily solved by...
So let me jump on something you said there, which was when you expand service, it's typically to areas that have less demand. Does that suggest that maybe the problem is we need to be expanding services somewhere else? I mean, is that a problem of expanding service generally or just how we've been doing it?
Well, it's a combination of the two. It's a political problem for agencies like King County because you have suburban areas that are being taxed and they want additional service of some kind. And many of them feel that they have been shortchanged for many years. And
well, no, I'm excited about paying car tabs in Issaquah for Sound Transit that I'll see in 2041.
Thank you for that corroborating testimony.
But
so go ahead.
There's also this problem. what's your plan B? We look at the growth projections for the region, and we know millions of people are coming here. We know they're going to live here, there, and everywhere. How do you propose their mobility demand is going to be met? More cars? More single occupancy vehicle trips? More roads? More bridges? More roads? And more roads after that? Wider roads. I mean, I did my time with Kemper Freeman, fighting to keep the 405 expansion, which has been successful in some respects and should be even more so with a stronger BRT component. And we cannot pave the entire region so everybody can drive every type place they want. And the notion that everybody is going to revert somehow to calling a robot car someplace to take them to the grocery or to take their kids to school, that's not a vision that I see a way forward to, because I don't think it fits in an economic paradigm where people can't afford Uber. And I don't see Uber costs coming down to where, what is now a $2.75 transit ride is a $11 transit ride for somebody who wants to go someplace. I think we need transit because we need to figure a way to get out of the car syndrome. I've worked on that problem for some time, and I think it's very, very intractable, and that we're basically going sideways or backwards. But I think that the arguments that it's all too difficult to solve through transit, or the land use things will come too slowly, we have to believe, I think, because the plan B is not a very attractive one. And there are a lot of problems. And one of the problems that's really not discussed at all, and is somewhat counter to what I'm suggesting, there is nothing worse for transportation emissions than building more concrete-intensive light rail. It's just a complete carbon disaster. You never recover the carbon. So, these questions are really complicated, but I think you've got to figure out how to move people in other than single occupancy vehicles, and you ought to call those things transit, and then figure out how to continue to press forward to make it work, and you ought to take the money and spend it for the benefits from that kind of mobility that you can secure and seize now. Speech ended.
Go ahead, Jim.
I think we should point out that Doug has been a hero a couple of different times in our recent past. One of those was when he beat back an Iman initiative, which would have made tolling illegal. And I got to work on tolling on 520. We implemented in 2010. And it was called the Urban Partnership Agreement. And it was between the transit agencies and WashDOT and the FTA. And everybody agreed that we should toll 520. And it actually worked out great because tolling was variable and congestion went away, transit flow improved, ridership went up, the network was better, everybody won, okay? The problem is that we haven't duplicated that on the rest of the roadway system, okay? We've built some failed projects because the northern end of 167 and the northern end of 405 have gridlock, okay? So I want to thank Doug for his work, both for defeating Iman and for helping us with 520 tolling. And that sort of tells us, well, that's one way the future can be improved. Because I see this future as being much more crowded. I think population is going to come here because we're going to have climate refugees. The rest of the United States is going to be hotter and drier. And people are going to come up to this northwest maritime climate, and there's going to be a lot more people here. Land is going to be more valuable. Parking is going to be very expensive, and so we're going to deal with the pricing mechanism to help us move around.
So I think that does. I have to say this. Sorry. I mean that relates to the robo-taxi idea, and whether it's autonomous taxis or autonomous personally owned vehicles. If we take the driver out of the equation, that's the single biggest component of the cost of operating a vehicle, which, number one, means that robo-taxis do become radically cheaper than Ubers today. But also, your single biggest deterrent to driving, the single biggest part of the cost of driving, gets cut dramatically. And so I will say it seems essential that if that is the future, that there's tolling in there. Otherwise, you have essentially no deterrent to an endless amount of driving.
Well, actually, it's very, Jack, thanks, Jack. And somebody who I had some connection with, my friend Scott Kubley, who, I think left somewhat. Scott actually approached me sometime and said, Doug, you and I should write an op-ed about congestion pricing in Seattle. We have to have congestion pricing. Mayor Durkin ran on a policy that suggested we should deal with congestion roadway pricing. And we're backwards, we've gone backwards so fast. And if you look at the questions of transit productivity, one of the really interesting issues that we confront is the right-of-way. We have limited right-of-way for transportation. You can build new guideways in Sound Transit. They're horrendously expensive. But the use of the existing right-of-way to move people is really the key to the mobility equation for more and more people coming to the region. We can't do it without pricing roadway use. And so in a funny sort of way, pricing roadway use and making roads and the right-of-way effective and efficient for transit are inseparable problems.
Do we know, has anyone looked at whether the effect of increasing congestion on some of these performance indicators for transit, the cost per passenger trip, the cost per passenger mile? Because if you're delivering fewer passenger miles per vehicle hour.
I did look at transit routes before COVID. I had some, an assignment that allowed me to do some studies like that. And there were many of those one-way peak-only routes that were on I-5 South or I-90 that were slowing because of congestion. Sound Transit took the center roadway of I-90 and the D2 roadway, so all the I-90 trips were slower after that happened.
I'll give you a crazy micro example of how sensitive this whole question is for productivity and right-of-way planning. SDOT, about a year and a half ago, put a whole batch of no turn-on right intersections on Aurora. What they didn't do was look at their own data. That was for pedestrian safety. What they didn't do was look at the data. And I had a chance to look at the data. I've actually mentioned this earlier to somebody who I want to call out. I think Ryan Packer is here. And they at the Urbanist have done an absolutely wonderful job of covering a lot of really sort of weedy transportation issues that need more attention because a lot of this stuff is in the weeds. I mentioned this to him earlier today. SDOT had 5 years of data, and as far as I was able to examine the data, there has not been a single collision at any of the intersections between a vehicle and a pedestrian in the 5 years before they implemented no turn on red. No turn on red make all kinds of sense at maybe 6th and Pike. In a pedestrian almost vacant intersection at, say, 97th or 95th on Aurora, there aren't very many pedestrians, and what the no turn on red has done is back up right turning traffic, putting buses in the transit lane behind traffic that can't get out of the way, messed up traffic system by priority, and SDOT's own consultant advised them that putting no turn on red on Aurora would increase transit times on Aurora. Well, hello. A lot of this stuff is pretty weedy, but if you want the right-of-way to work better, you've actually got to think about the right-of-way. And the notion that it sounds good for pedestrian safety to put in no turn on red may make sense in some places in Seattle. It, in my view, hasn't made very much sense on Aurora because I see the buses stacked in the bus lane behind the cars that want to turn right on 90th.
The absence of pedestrian crashes there, though, is that a function of it's a safe design, or is it a function of lack of exposure in that it's such an unappealing location that pedestrians are simply avoiding?
I won't say that.
Look at the data where pedestrian injuries are. They're in the downtown where there are lots, and the U District where there are lots of pedestrians.
The issue of pedestrians on Aurora is a fascinating one, which takes us in another whole direction. But there are the heaviest density pedestrian interchange on Aurora is at North Gateway and 105th, And for reasons that absolutely baffle me, that's the one intersection which I have it correct that they didn't put in no turn on red. I just don't get it. And their own
You don't want to
consultant,
stop your car there.
and their own consultant told them this was going to slow transit. So in the Seattle Transportation Plan, one of the goals of the Seattle Transportation Plan is to increase transit reliability and speed. So connect the dots. And a lot of things that are like that. I mean, Jack is, if you want to know anything about the network in Seattle, don't call Jack unless you want to spend the whole afternoon riding around on a bus learning about it. And some of these issues of network design, I mean, Jack's got a whole thing about the 40 and the bicycle conflict in Fremont, which is a PhD dissertation. So this stuff becomes very nerdy, and Jack's not nerdy. But you have to get into you have to start thinking not on grand scales, but in micro scales about how to make the system work so that you get the most out of it that you can. And that applies to the entire right-of-way.
All right. We've talked a few times about Sound Transit and ST3. I want to turn now to the question of, in August, Sound Transit revealed a $30 billion increase in the cost of their light rail plan. And in conjunction with that, they announced an enterprise initiative aimed at identifying revisions to make their plan more affordable within expected revenues. Is this enterprise initiative going to help with these unfavorable transit performance trends?
Well, I'll say that in preparing for this, I went and looked at the slide deck for the enterprise initiative, and it is an eyeful. It really should be called "We're Dead in the Water. What in the heck do we do now?" There are issues. The issues include the capital cost issues, the implementation issues around the pieces of ST3 which are hanging in balance, a whole set of issues about diminished revenue capacity that need to be solved, a set of issues which, again, I'll mention, Ryan, they've written about the resilience issues which have largely been underreported with respect to how the one line is supposed to function as more and more trains are supposed to operate on the one line with some very serious resilience issues which go to basic design issues and oversights or mistakes or cost settings years and years ago. These things are set up in a series of matrices which I find has a new term. When you read government stuff, you're always looking for the new words, which are supposed to tell you they're doing something, and they're called work streams. There are 4 work streams in the enterprise initiative, and most of them say, we are really in a hard place. What are we going to do now? And interestingly, it emphasizes the fact that the last time that Sound Transit had a comprehensive service series plan, an actual planning document, was I think in 2016. And so, and you are faced with the fact that the governance structure, I mean, I say to myself, how many of us are realizing that actually the governance structure isn't working as good as we had hoped? What the Congress is supposed to do, the Supreme Court is supposed to do, and the President is supposed to do, and what we understood to be the governance structure isn't working that well right now. If you look at Sound Transit and ask yourself, how is the governance structure supposed to work with the sub-area equity issues around finance, the division between the various regions that we're supposed to build a system from Tacoma to Everett, the needs of Seattle as where high-capacity transit is most evident at the time, and you ask yourself, can this Board of Governors sort its way through the issues that are presented by what is called the Enterprise Initiative? I came away feeling, oh my brother, this is worse than I thought. And sometime in the end of this year, we're going to have to get some information from Sound Transit about whether or not they've got a way forward, and if so, whether it will be acceptable to the people who have to vote on it. And I found myself saying to myself, you know, I've had reservations about Sound Transit, but I didn't realize that they had the reservations about Sound Transit that are revealed in this document, because they've got some serious problems.
Sometimes it's reassuring if someone has a little self-awareness, but do others want to weigh in on this question?
Oh, I agree with everything Doug said. I think it's good that they're reassessing. They really have to. They are dead in the water. But let's see that we've done this before. Sound Move had a crisis in 1999, and they had a 2-year pause. They decided to change Sound Move in a very big way. They found that the North King County sub-area couldn't afford to build link between Northeast 45th Street and the city limits. And Executive Sims and Mayor Shell put forward a proposal to the board saying, well, let's focus the North King County money on link between 45th and Mount Baker, and we'll build a much better bus system for the Rainier Valley and South King County and Pierce County with center access ramp at South Industrial Way. Well, the board said, no way. The board was already committed to the link spine. And I have to say that I helped the senior planner work on that memo. I really wanted it to go through, but the board said no. So they stewed around for 2 years, and they decided to build Link South first. I think they had to do something because the state Senate might have voted them out of existence otherwise. And I think Metro and Seattle were heroic after that decision to get many more buses through downtown Seattle than the capacity analysis had shown was possible. And they did a great job up until March of 2019. So yeah, they're dead in the water. They're going to have to do a big reset. It might be bigger than the reset that was done in 2001. There was a minor reset to ST2. And as Doug has said, I think ST2 Link will be great. It could have been better in some ways, but it'll be great, and we can build a good bus system around it.
Charles, do you want to offer any thoughts on the Enterprise Initiative?
Yeah. Sound Transit likes to describe this as though it's just a budget problem. But really, the problem is their plan. And it was fatally flawed from the beginning. This has only become more apparent now that they've got this $30+ billion cost increase, which busts their budget. But the reality is none of the link extensions in the ST3 plan made sense even from the beginning. Since then, costs have doubled or tripled, or in the case of the West Seattle extension, maybe quadrupled. $8 billion for 4 miles and 4 stations. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. No competent board would ever sign off on that. To make matters worse, the ridership forecasts have been scaled back. So you're paying billions of dollars and destroying neighborhoods for gaining very few new riders. If the Enterprise Initiative focuses on trying to salvage those link extensions, it doesn't solve the region's problems or really even Sound Transit's problems. It's a negative sum game in reality. It's just a political tug of war between the sub-areas. The Enterprise Initiative could be very useful if Sound Transit is willing to look seriously and objectively at the alternatives to those light rail extensions. Because I can tell you as a former transit planner, if you gave me even a paltry few $billion, I could greatly improve transit ridership across the region.
And meanwhile, I mean, some of this stuff this doesn't compute. In order to demonstrate the city's commitment to Ballard and West Seattle, and apparently the city has now hired 51 people to work in a special office to do nothing but to make sure that the planning for West Seattle and Ballard goes more quickly and efficiently, maybe cutting permitting times from 200 days to 100 days. 51 people. And for a program today which has to be rescued from being dead in the water, and Metro, with those resources, using 50, I mean, there's the old business about, how long does it take one person to paint a phone booth? How long does it take 10 people to paint a phone booth? Well, maybe 51 people is more people than Metro could efficiently use working on some of the Metro planning issues. But there's a resource there of people and money which is being touted really as a political commitment by Seattle to the light rail extensions. Well, there's a significant question about whether that's even a reality play at this point, and where we need money and talent planning things that will work for people who want to get around.
So I'm going to go to Jack first on this because I cut you off when you started to go to automation.
I just want to agree with Doug again, and I want to let Doug know that I wrote the mayor and the council on that very issue. Mayor Harrell's notion of speeding up permits might save months of time and millions of dollars, but the ST3 issues are years of time and billions of dollars. So it's inadequate, and so Doug is right. I hope SDOT finds better things to do for those 51 people. And I guess I should confess to everybody that I did vote no on ST3 because I didn't like any of the projects or the taxes or the timing. We need much better local service in South King County. We needed the metro local option first, not later.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in too that even though the news media tends to focus on Link and light rail because those are high profile, big dollar involved, when we look at what actually carries most of the transit riders in the region, it isn't light rail. Even after 25 years of Sound Transit, Metro still has, 2 or 3 times the number of riders that ride light rail. So even though we've seen a significant percentage increase in light rail ridership in the graph you showed, in absolute numbers, buses are actually doing the heavy lifting, and that's going to continue in the future. Light rail just doesn't serve enough places, and the extensions in the ST3 plan add so few riders that it doesn't really move the needle very much. I'd also point out that since 2019, even though Sound Transit has gained some light rail riders, Metro lost about 6 riders for each light rail rider that Link gained. So that indicates to me that building out light rail lines is not the solution to our transit problem at all. And we should, as Doug has pointed out, really focus on how can we improve the bus system, because it actually provides much greater system-wide capacity and it serves more locations. If there's a solution to our transit challenges, it's on the bus side, not on the light rail side. And I wish the
I want to make sure. Well, just hold on a second, please, because we're actually about to go to questions from the audience. Yeah, I was gonna take us there right now. Do you want to say something quickly, Doug, before we open up the floor?
Just to say that another issue that hangs over this whole thing is the fact that financial considerations have forced Metro to postpone for 5 years the plan for the electrification of the Metro buses. And they're taking the savings or the expenditures that they won't make and investing it in service. That just seems to me like such a good practical decision because of all of the issues that have proven to be so problematic about what was supposed to be a great thing, the electrification of the buses, but turns out to be not so great at all because the technology, just for a whole bunch of reasons, which once again Ryan has laid out. And so the weeds are where a lot of important decisions have to be made to make things work better with limited resources and particularized opportunities.
Thanks, Doug. So I want to open things up to the audience now. I think the one thing I will say is please make sure that the microphone is brought to you before you start to talk, because we are broadcasting and recording. So you've been very eager. I will say let's try and keep our questions short and make sure they end in a question mark.
Just 2 questions. And I'm just a tax-paying citizen. I live out in Issaquah. But I appreciate what you guys are doing here, and this is fascinating. 2 questions. One, if the new leader of Sound Transit was sitting amongst you, what would he be saying right now? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is, again, I'm just a general public kind of guy. What city in the United States should we be emulating? Who is doing this right? The developing public transportation.
I would have to go outside the country and say Vancouver, BC, Toronto, Ontario, and Montreal.
And what are they doing different?
Well, Vancouver, the best thing Vancouver does is have automated trains, so no operators. They have very short headway. They do a great job of minimizing the seams when you have transfers between bus and rail. There's a minimized walk distance for those transfers, and the time is short. And time is the biggest factor for ridership. And so I would look to TransLink, and consider them our big sister. Where should we do transit? Do it more like Vancouver.
And what would you say to, and it doesn't have to be you, but what would you say if Dow Constantine were here?
Well, I happened to hear I heard Dow last Monday. There was a TCC function in Bertha Landis, and he made his pitch for the Enterprise Initiative, and he was more open than I expected him to be, and he said just about what Doug did, that they need to do a reset. So I was pleased. But he's the main reason we're in this mess. Don't let me get. But he knows it now. He knows it.
In his previous role?
Yes. He was the main reason that we had an ST3, and I think the main reason that it was the way it was.
Anyone else want to offer a different model of who's doing this well? Otherwise, let's.
I already mentioned Spokane. They have a good network designer.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I am another East Sider who came in here. I'm interested if our friend from Issaquah came in on Sound Transit and is going back on Sound Transit.
Not a chance.
Okay. I tried to come in on the 542, which has a stop less than a mile from my house, but the timing was terrible. And in fact, I can't get home at all until I could kiss my wife and say, I'll see you tomorrow. So I came in my electric car, and I came here, and I'm a little bit appalled because we are getting a viewpoint here that ignores well over 90% of the users of our road system, of our transportation system, not just road system, but transportation system. And all of the three people here represent backgrounds that came from transit. If this were Parliament or the Diet in Japan and I went in and said, I proudly represent 2.6% of your constituents, you have to adopt my programs, what do you think the response would be?
So what would the response be?
So my question is, I have a question. My question is, how will transit in particular be relevant to solving all of our transportation problems in the future? Because when you have somebody who admits that they have lived here for 20 years and never driven a car on a Washignton road, you have a depth of ignorance, I think, which is appalling.
So
Okay,
so the question, I think, was what it was.
Well,
How is transit going to be relevant to our future?
Okay.
let me try that.
Downsizing is going to be part of it.
Let me try that. First of all, mobility is really the issue, and it's really interesting. And for the fact that I, because of my sight impairment, have not driven in Seattle, doesn't mean as Secretary of Transportation, I didn't drive on every single road in Washington State. I built the new Tacoma Narrows Bridge. I built the 405 expansion. I got the viaduct taken down and one thing and another. And when I look at Seattle, what absolutely astonishes me is that there appears to be no advocacy group in Seattle anywhere for people who drive. And I believe that the question of transit's role is that transit has a very important role in dealing with some of the problem. And other pieces of the problem have to be dealt in other ways. Now, I have a problem because my grandkids live in Kenmore. And it's a hell of a lot easier to drive from Green Lake to Kenmore than it is to go on a bus. I can go on a bus. I take the 45 to Roosevelt, and I get on the 522 from Roosevelt and take it out to Lake Forest to Kenmore. Sound Transit's and got a new plan, which is that the 522 is going to be, as soon as the link station at 145 is open, the 522 won't go to Forestville Station anymore. It'll go from Kenmore to Shoreline. I'll have a 3-seat ride rather than a 2-seat ride to go see my grandkids. But I'll tell you something else about transit, because I tell people that I can't believe this. Well, I go occasionally to Olympia because I still once in a while get down there to do something of a sort of quasi-official function. I find the funniest thing in Washington State about being an ex-Secretary of Transportation is trying to get to Olympia on a bus. It's a hoot. I mean, it's a whole day. You can't get there for a 10 o'clock meeting, and it is a whole day problem to get from Seattle to Olympia on public transit. 3 different.
So I think
that's crazy. And so it's a complex thing, and all of the pieces of the problem have to be independently addressed to maximize the system that works for as many people as possible as best as can.
So I'll just I want to chime in because I think where transit advocates, and there are many of them in Seattle, sometimes go astray is in an insistence that transit can solve every problem that we have, because it can't. But I think it's equally fallacious to expect that transit can solve it, from a car advocate's perspective or a driver's perspective, to expect that transit is going to do something directly for you everywhere throughout the county. It's something that needs the right environment to work in. And, it's the future of public transportation panels. So I think that, that's why we have these distinguished speakers. Right. Anyway, so Charles, you wanted to chime in.
Well, I wanted to mention that the topic of this event is the future of public transportation, and that's why we have been focusing on that issue. You were certainly right that transit represents a small fraction of total trips in the region. It accommodates a very small share of the region's mobility needs or the state's mobility needs, and none of its needs for freight mobility, for instance. My fear is that the way things are going, transit isn't going to be able to significantly expand its market share. In fact, it may keep shrinking. That isn't a popular opinion to express, and I say that as a person who's made the mistake of saying that at meetings at the Puget Sound Regional Council and elsewhere. So, your point is certainly well taken. I would also point out, though, that if you look, for instance, at the PSRC plan, you see that it spends about $300 billion through 2050, at least that's the assumption, and more than 60% of that is on transit. So not only is the transit mode share small, low single digits for most of the region, but its share of the total revenue that we spend on transportation is very large. And that's an issue that, as Doug was pointing out, you could attribute to sort of a governance failure more than a planning failure. But there is a big disconnect there. There's no doubt of it.
Do we have other questions? Yes, at the back.
So I'm all about us learning from other cities that do transit more successfully. And one of the things that really pains me is that around the world, so we are planning to build a second transit tunnel downtown for the ST3 extensions, something that's going to cost a few $1 billion. And the reason cited is that we don't have capacity in the current tunnel. The capacity we need is 22.5 trains per hour per the planned ST3 frequency for these routes. Around the world, there are many cities that do far more than that, 30 to 40. Certainly many places in Europe, but even here in the United States, on the West Coast, in San Francisco, with a much more difficult to manage light rail system because their trains do not run in dedicated right-of-way and arrive at the tunnel entrances at very random times. They have a system that's designed for 60 trains per hour and handles 45. So almost double what we need for Sound Transit 3. So I'm very glad that board member, council member Claudio Balducci has sort of, I've seen some interest.
Sorry, what's your question?
Well, the question is, sorry for a long-winded, what would it take for us to not waste so many billions of transit dollars on a second tunnel and redirect this money back to the sub-areas where it can build anything that the sub-areas need?
So it sounds like Anton has joined the discussion at the Seattle Transit blog, which I read pretty carefully, and there are pretty smart people there that thought about ST3 Link and have suggested that a different mode be chosen and that the Ballard line just go to a transfer point at Westlake, and it might be SkyTrain technology, And so that's the kind of thing that Dow's reset might do. So it's a cause for optimism.
So are you suggesting that we might not be locked in because of the very first segment that we built being at grade, that we might not be locked in forever on all lines throughout the system?
In your example of Vancouver, they have 3 or 4 different lines, and the technology changed a little bit each time. The first SkyTrain line had very short cars, and now they have longer cars on their subsequent trains. So,
But they've been automated since 1986.
oh yes,
Yeah, just to be clear, if anyone's keeping track. Does anyone else want to address the question of tunnels? All right. Sorry, the gentleman at the back was actually waiting as well.
Thank you so much. You spent some time talking about the impacts of COVID on, boardings and operating costs. One COVID era kind of impact to transit in Washington State and across the country that keeps me up at night is the precipitous drop in the fare box recovery ratio. I'd love to hear from the panelists what their thoughts about the future of what happened with the fare box recovery ratio going down during COVID era, and how's it getting back up or not going back up, and what the future of increasing or decreasing that fare box recovery ratio in terms of helping cover those increasing operating costs. Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, both Sound Transit and Metro were running around 30%. The state as a whole was running around 26% before COVID, and those are down around 10% today. Yes.
that fraction is operating revenue divided by operating expense. And before COVID, say in 2018, the figure in Seattle was probably 40% and 30% countywide, as was said. And COVID led to a big decrease in ridership, and Sound Transit and Metro both suspended their fare collection, partly for COVID reasons, but they've both begun to inspect fares again, and as I said earlier, Metro is deciding to do it network-wide, which I see as a cause for optimism about the future. So I think that's a national trend, and now the national trend is for ridership to go back up.
Well, one of the disadvantages of being on a panel with Jack Wisner is that I end up sounding like a pessimist. I'm really an optimistic guy. But when it comes to farebox recovery ratios, the news is almost all bad. And as was pointed out, farebox recovery ratio was, 20, 30%, something like that pre-COVID. And it's about 10% now, a little bit higher for Link, I think. But it's going to be very difficult for transit agencies to significantly increase that for two reasons. One is operating costs keep going up. And as operating costs go up, to keep a constant percentage, you would have to increase fares. And that is hard for transit agencies to do because they simply don't have as much pricing power as they used to. I mean, when you're only carrying a small percentage of total trips, some of those people are not paying their fares. In the case of Link, it was about 40% of the boardings were what they called non-revenue boardings. So clearly, it is a very significant challenge for transit, and it has implications for their revenue projections far into the future. I'll be very surprised if the transit agencies in the state, any of them, can significantly increase their farebox recovery ratio in the future.
So this is data. You can see here fare revenue per passenger trip, per boarding, for all agencies, all modes at the top, Sound Transit Light Rail in yellow, King County Metro and other agencies' buses there. So you can see these are down. These are not even inflation adjusted, so these are down even more if you were working in inflation adjusted terms. And this is, again, this is the revenues, and then we saw before the costs have gone up a lot, 40% inflation adjusted.
I'm surprised it isn't worse than that. Is that the fare revenue collected for the people who actually paid fares, or is that all passengers divided by the amount of, or all revenue divided by the number of
You're
boardings.
getting into the minutia of how NTD collects data, and I don't
Okay.
know if Jack knows that or.
I expect you've got operating revenue and then the measurement of riders by the APC, automatic passenger counter. So you're not measuring ridership through the fare box.
Okay. Anyway, it's not a pretty picture.
Part of I'm the wrong person. Having boasted of the fact that I rode the buses all day today for $1, I'm the wrong person to make this argument. Because with both with respect to roads and with respect to transit, free is not good. Free roads contribute to congestion and to the inefficient use of roads. Free transit is we're not paying for the mobility service that is actually quite valuable to us and which we underpay for, and I underpay more than most people. And so the notion that you should actually have to pay to ride a bus or pay to ride a link to take you someplace 2 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles is something that we kind of got to get used to, and the notion that Sound Transit's future depends so far on a financial plan that includes fare box recovery. We either have to buy or we're going to have to find some other way of doing it. There's no free lunch, and that even applies to transportation.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick question, so let's go down here.
Thank you. John Niles.
Wait for the mic. Sorry.
John Niles and I co-chair an organization for the last 25 years called smartertransit.org, and we've got lots of information on there about this. Pro-transit people, not light rail in this region. I also was on the King County Council and was on the congestion pricing task force as a representative to the Puget Sound Regional Council. So we did this major work on congestion pricing that never got anywhere until relatively recently, but could be applied for sure. According to the PSRC, in their 2050 plan, traffic by 2050 is going to increase. It's even with full build-out of light rail. Traffic's going to increase 54%. Of the 24 million trips a day, we're at 16-something now. Only about 3% will be on light rail. My question is, what's driving this? I believe it's a lot of people making a lot of money in the construction companies and the real estate firms, because it's certainly not in terms of doing a real cost-benefit analysis of the investment in rail. But do you agree with that, or what else could be driving this?
Pass.
I think some of it is the belief that people have that if we just spend enough on transit, it'll solve our problems. But if we look back at the last 20 years and the huge increase in how much we're spending, I mean, in the Puget Sound region, it's about, $3.5 billion a year now goes into public transportation. But ridership is lower today than it was 10 years ago. Costs of operation is significantly higher. And even the most optimistic forecasts show very little increase in transit mode share. Realistically, it's probably going to decrease. So somehow the people who are in elective office, who are responsible for making decisions about how we spend our transportation dollars, they need to get realistic about what transit can really accomplish. And as we've seen, when they've bought into a plan and they're on a transit board, they hate to change their mind. It's almost more of a political problem than it is a technical problem.
I should pass like Doug, but I'm going to say something anyway. I think one of the problems with Maggie's question is that it assumes that transit's role is to reduce congestion, and that's not true. So the main objective of transit is to extend the range of pedestrians. It has nothing to do with reducing congestion. If we want to reduce congestion, we need to impose decongestion pricing on the highways.
Yeah, no, that was not my...
Okay. But
I totally agree that we need judicial crisis.
Is that, were you done? Sorry.
Yes, I'm
Okay.
through.
Okay. So what I want to do now is just
Can I just
welcome.
say one thing? I think
Oh,
that,
he's not passing.
Maggie, the problem is, who do we blame? And I'm very heartened that Jack says that the last time he heard Dow talk, he thinks Dow's maybe making some sense. If we can get out of blaming how we got here, and it's very complicated, and try to figure out how do we move forward from where we are now, I think it's a better spending of our energy.
All right. What I want to do now, so that we can finish on time at 8, is invite each of you to maybe offer a couple minutes of closing comments. And why don't we can start at this end. Sure. Yeah.
Well, we haven't talked about e-scooters, and I'll pass on that too. Otherwise, the only thing that I think has been missed is my first answer, I think, cut short a little bit the question of what do we think about automation and robo-vehicles, whatever that is. And I think that that's an area that I need a lot more thought of. I'm delighted to see that John Niles is here, who's somebody who's thought about it a lot. And I think that kind of like making a cake, baking in with everything else we've talked about, the question of automation and how automation can help with some of these issues in all modes with all kinds of transportation mobility is a big issue that offers us promise and challenge.
I tend to agree with Doug about e-scooters and e-bikes as well, but we'll be quiet about that.
No, they don't do anything. I'll say it.
The way I like to think about transit is that its main objective is to extend the range of pedestrians. And Doug mentioned I-405 BRT. And I see that as an unfortunate political compromise between the forces of the last 20 years. And it's going to be very difficult to get pedestrians into the center of 405. And so that system will rely on buses to get people to Stride 2 and 3, just like Link will rely on buses to get to and from its stations. Final thought about freeways is that a freeway is a pedestrian as a dam is to fish. So that's a mistake that Sound Transit has made. They've put too many of their stations in the freeway envelope. But that decision's been made. Linwood Link's still going to be great. It could have been better if it was somewhere else, but we're going to make it great where it is. See, still being optimistic.
Yes, I think maybe.
Well, there's a difference between relitigating the past and learning from it. And I think the hope is that we can learn from some of these mistakes going forward.
I'd just say that with what the region's taxpayers are already paying for transit, which is one of the highest rates of subsidy in the country, we should be getting better results than we are seeing. And if you take a hard look at what's in the PSRC plan and in some of the transit agency plans, significant transit projects actually have a negative return on public investment. They should not be made. To look at the positive side, that tells me there's a lot of room for improvement. What makes me less optimistic is I haven't seen the agencies and institutions that make the decisions about transportation plans and transit in particular pay attention to benefit cost analysis, realistic assumptions, and things like that. So without some kind of legislative or institutional reform, I think we're going to have continuing suboptimal plans and poor transit performance.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank the three of you for joining us. Thank everyone for coming this evening. I hope this was an interesting discussion. I want to make sure we end on time here. So I'll just say thanks again, and thank you to PACTRANS and the WPC for sponsoring this event. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Wasn't so bad. What's that? That wasn't so bad. That's fine.
John's new book.